The year is 399 BC, and the most famous trial in human history is about to begin. In a cramped Athenian courtroom, 500 jurors will decide the fate of a man who never wrote a single word, never conquered a city, never accumulated wealth or power. Yet this barefoot philosopher will become more influential than Alexander the Great, more enduring than the Parthenon itself. His name is Socrates, and today we embark on the complete journey of his extraordinary life. Picture this: you're walking through the bustling agora of ancient Athens. Merchants hawk their wares, politicians deliver speeches, and children play between the marble columns. But there, in the centre of it all, stands a peculiar figure. He's short, stocky, with a face that could charitably be called ugly. His nose is flat, his eyes bulge, and his lips are thick. He wears a simple cloak that's seen better days, and his feet are bare despite the rough stone beneath them. This is Socrates, and he's about to change your life forever by asking you a single question. What makes a person wise? It seems simple enough, but within moments, this strange man has you tied in logical knots, questioning everything you thought you knew about wisdom, virtue, and the very nature of knowledge itself. Welcome to the world of Socrates, where no assumption goes unchallenged and no comfortable belief remains unexamined. But how did this unlikely figure become the founding father of Western philosophy? How did a stonecutter's son from Athens develop a method of questioning that would outlast empires and reshape human thought? Today, we're diving deep into the complete life of Socrates, from his humble beginnings to his dramatic final moments. We'll explore his revolutionary ideas, his dangerous influence on Athenian youth, and the trial that would make him immortal. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why this man who claimed to know nothing changed everything we think we know about thinking itself. Let me give you a glimpse of what's coming. We'll witness Socrates' birth during Athens' golden age, follow him through the devastating Peloponnesian War, and watch him develop the method that would make him both beloved and despised. We'll meet his brilliant student Plato, encounter his shrewish wife Xanthippe, and discover how his strange divine voice guided his every decision. Most importantly, we'll uncover why the Athenians ultimately decided that this questioner of everything had to die. This isn't just the story of one man. This is the story of how philosophy was born, how critical thinking began, and how one individual's courage to ask uncomfortable questions created a legacy that still shapes our world today. So settle in, because we're about to meet the man who taught humanity how to think. Socrates was born around 470 BC into a world that was rapidly changing. Athens, his birthplace, stood at the centre of the Greek world like a brilliant jewel. The Persian Wars had just ended with stunning Greek victories at Marathon and Salamis, and Athens was entering what we now call its golden age. The Parthenon was rising on the Acropolis, democracy was flourishing in the Agora, and Greek culture was spreading across the Mediterranean like wildfire. But let's zoom in on the man himself. Socrates came from humble origins that would shape his entire worldview. His father, Sophroniscus, was a stonecutter or sculptor, a craftsman who worked with his hands to create beauty from rough marble. His mother, Phaenarete, served as a midwife, helping bring new life into the world. These occupations were far from glamorous, but they would profoundly influence Socrates' understanding of his own mission in life. Think about what these professions represented. A stonecutter takes rough, formless rock and carefully chips away everything unnecessary to reveal the beautiful statue hidden within. A midwife doesn't create the baby, but helps bring forth what's already there, asking the right questions and providing the right guidance at the crucial moments. Socrates would later describe his own work in exactly these terms. He was a spiritual midwife, helping others give birth to ideas they already possessed but didn't know they had. The Athens of Socrates' youth was unlike anywhere else in the ancient world. It was a democracy, though a limited one, where citizens could speak freely in the assembly, and participate in governing their city. It was a place where playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides explored the deepest questions of human existence, where historians like Herodotus were inventing the very concept of historical inquiry, and where architects were creating buildings that would inspire awe for millennia. Yet it was also a city at war. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta began when Socrates was in his 30s and would rage for nearly 3 decades. This wasn't some distant conflict fought by professional soldiers. Every Athenian citizen was expected to serve as a hoplite, a heavily armed foot soldier, when called upon. Socrates answered that call multiple times, serving with distinction in battles that would determine the fate of Greek civilization. But what was the young Socrates like before he became the philosopher we know? The evidence suggests he followed his father's trade initially, working as a sculptor or stonecutter. Some ancient sources even claim they could point to statues he had carved, though this may be legend rather than fact. What's certain is that he received the typical education of an Athenian citizen, learning to read and write, studying Homer and the other poets, and training in athletics and music. The turning point in Socrates' life came through an event so strange it sounds like fiction. His friend Chaerephon, described by Plato as impetuous and eager, travelled to the oracle at Delphi with a burning question. The oracle was the most sacred shrine in the Greek world, where the priestess of Apollo delivered cryptic prophecies that shaped the decisions of kings and common citizens alike. Chaerephon asked the oracle a simple question that would change the course of Western philosophy forever. Is anyone wiser than Socrates? The oracle's answer was unequivocal. No one is wiser than Socrates. When Chaerephon returned to Athens with this pronouncement, Socrates was baffled. He knew he possessed no special wisdom. He had no expertise in politics, poetry, craftsmanship, or any of the fields that Athenians respected. How could he be the wisest man in Greece? This question consumed him. Unable to dismiss the oracle's words, Socrates embarked on a mission that would define the rest of his life. He decided to test the oracle by seeking out the wisest people in Athens and questioning them about their knowledge. If he could find someone wiser than himself, he would prove the oracle wrong and solve the mystery. His first stop was the politicians, the men who governed Athens and made decisions affecting thousands of lives. Surely they possessed wisdom about justice, courage, and the art of leadership. But when Socrates questioned them, something remarkable happened. Through careful, persistent questioning, he exposed that these confident leaders couldn't define the very concepts they claimed to understand. They spoke eloquently about justice, but couldn't say what justice actually was. They praised courage but fell apart when asked to explain its nature. Next, he turned to the poets, the men who created the beautiful verses that all Athenians memorized and revered. Poetry was considered a form of divine inspiration, and poets were thought to possess special insight into the human condition. But again, Socrates' questioning revealed something troubling. The poets couldn't explain their own works. They created beautiful art through inspiration or habit, but they lacked the knowledge to understand what made their creations meaningful. Finally, he approached the craftsmen, the skilled workers who created everything from pottery to weapons. Here at last, he found genuine knowledge. A shoemaker truly understood shoes. A blacksmith understood metal. A carpenter understood wood. But Socrates discovered a crucial problem. Because these craftsmen knew their specific trades well, they assumed they also possessed wisdom about everything else. They confused expertise in one narrow field with general wisdom about life itself. Through this exhaustive investigation, Socrates reached a startling conclusion. The oracle was right, but not in the way anyone expected. Socrates was indeed the wisest person in Athens, but only because he alone knew that he didn't know. Everyone else lived under the illusion of knowledge, confidently making decisions and offering opinions about subjects they didn't truly understand. Socrates had achieved what we might call the wisdom of ignorance, the recognition that true wisdom begins with admitting what we don't know. This revelation transformed Socrates from a simple craftsman into something unprecedented in human history, a professional questioner. He began spending his days in the agora, the marketplace that served as the heart of Athenian public life, engaging anyone willing to talk in philosophical conversations. His method was deceptively simple. He would ask questions, probe assumptions, and expose contradictions until both he and his conversation partner reached a state of productive confusion. This wasn't idle intellectual exercise. Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. Most people sleepwalk through existence, accepting inherited beliefs, social conventions, and comfortable assumptions without ever testing them against reason. They mistake opinion for knowledge, tradition for truth, and confidence for wisdom. Socrates saw himself as Athens' gadfly, sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse of the state into wakefulness. But there was something else driving Socrates beyond mere intellectual curiosity. Throughout his life, he claimed to be guided by a mysterious inner voice he called his daimonion. This wasn't a voice that told him what to do, but rather one that warned him away from certain actions. When he was about to make a mistake or pursue the wrong course, the voice would intervene with a divine prohibition. This supernatural guidance convinced Socrates that his mission of questioning and examining was divinely ordained. The young men of Athens found this strange figure irresistible. Here was someone who could make the most respected citizens look foolish through simple questions, who feared no authority except truth itself, and who lived according to principles rather than convenience. They flocked to him, not as students in any formal sense, but as companions drawn to his magnetic combination of intellectual rigour and moral courage. Among these young followers were some who would become the most famous names in Western history. There was Plato, the aristocratic youth who would become philosophy's greatest writer. There was Xenophon, the soldier and historian who would preserve many of Socrates' conversations for posterity. There was Alcibiades, the brilliant and scandalous politician whose relationship with Socrates would later contribute to the philosopher's downfall. As word of this peculiar philosopher spread throughout Athens, reactions were decidedly mixed. The older generation, particularly those in positions of power, viewed Socrates with growing suspicion and irritation. Here was a man who made their sons question everything they had been taught, who undermined traditional authorities and who seemed to delight in exposing the ignorance of respected leaders. To them, Socrates represented a dangerous force of disruption in a society that valued order and tradition. But the youth saw something entirely different. They witnessed a man who lived by his principles regardless of the consequences, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to cut through pretense and reach the heart of any matter, and who treated a slave with the same respect as a general. In a society obsessed with status, wealth, and appearance, Socrates offered something revolutionary. The idea that the only thing truly worth pursuing was wisdom, and that wisdom was available to anyone willing to examine their life honestly. The method Socrates developed during these years would later be called the Socratic method, though he never gave it that name himself. It was elegant in its simplicity, yet devastating in its effectiveness. He would begin with what seemed like innocent questions about concepts everyone thought they understood. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? What is friendship? These weren't abstract philosophical puzzles to Socrates, but the most practical questions imaginable. After all, how can you live courageously if you don't know what courage is? How can you act justly if you can't define justice? The conversations typically followed a predictable pattern that became known as the Socratic paradox. Socrates would approach someone who had a reputation for knowledge in a particular area. He would ask them to define a concept central to their expertise. They would offer what seemed like a reasonable definition. Then Socrates would ask probing questions that revealed problems with the definition. The person would revise their answer. More questions would expose new problems. This process would continue until both parties reached aporia, a state of productive confusion where they realized they didn't understand what they thought they knew. But Socrates never left people in this state of confusion without purpose. He believed that recognizing our ignorance was the essential first step toward genuine knowledge. You cannot learn what you think you already know. Only by clearing away false beliefs and comfortable illusions could the mind become receptive to truth. This process was often painful, like the pangs of childbirth, but Socrates insisted it was necessary for intellectual and moral growth. Consider how radical this approach was in ancient Athens. This was a society where wisdom was associated with age, authority, and social position. Teachers were expected to fill students with knowledge, not empty them of false beliefs. Yet here was Socrates, claiming that the path to wisdom led through admitting ignorance, and that the most important truths couldn't simply be transferred from teacher to student, but had to be discovered through personal investigation. The physical appearance of this revolutionary thinker only added to his mystique. Ancient sources consistently describe Socrates as remarkably ugly by conventional standards. Plato compared him to a satyr, those half-human creatures from Greek mythology known for their grotesque features. His eyes bulged like a crab's, his nose was flat and wide, his lips were thick, and his belly protruded. He walked barefoot through the streets of Athens in all weather, wearing the same rough cloak year after year. Yet those who knew him well reported that his physical ugliness somehow transformed into a kind of beauty when he spoke about philosophy. His eyes would light up with an inner fire, his voice would take on a musical quality, and his entire presence would become magnetic. It was as if his soul was so beautiful that it transfigured his unprepossessing exterior. This transformation became a powerful symbol of Socratic philosophy. True beauty lies not in appearances, but in the condition of the soul. Socrates' domestic life was equally unconventional, and would become the subject of countless jokes and stories throughout antiquity. He was married to a woman named Xanthippe, who has gone down in history as the archetypal shrewish wife. Ancient sources paint her as constantly nagging, argumentative, and frustrated with her philosopher husband, who spent his days talking in the marketplace instead of earning money to support their family. The couple had 3 sons together, Lamprocles, Sophroniscus, and Menexenus. The youngest was still a child when Socrates died, which adds a particularly poignant element to his final days. Despite later legends that portrayed Xanthippe as impossible to live with, the reality was probably more complex. She was married to a man who had essentially abandoned any attempt at conventional success, who attracted constant controversy, and who seemed more concerned with the souls of young aristocrats than with providing for his own family. Yet Socrates seemed genuinely fond of his wife, often using their relationship as an example in his philosophical discussions. When someone asked him why he had married such a difficult woman, he reportedly replied that it was like learning to ride a spirited horse. If you can manage the most challenging mount, all others will seem easy by comparison. This wasn't necessarily a compliment to Xanthippe, but it revealed Socrates' tendency to find philosophical lessons in every aspect of life. The question of how Socrates supported himself and his family remains one of the mysteries of his biography. Unlike the sophists, those professional teachers who charged substantial fees for their instruction, Socrates never took money for his philosophical conversations. He insisted that wisdom couldn't be bought or sold, that it was a divine gift freely given and freely shared. This principled stance earned him respect from some quarters, but also contributed to his family's poverty. Some sources suggest that Socrates may have inherited enough property from his father to live modestly without working. Others proposed that wealthy admirers occasionally supported him, though he would have been careful to avoid any arrangement that might compromise his independence. What's certain is that he lived simply, owning little beyond the basic necessities of life, and seemed genuinely indifferent to material wealth. This indifference to money and possessions was part of a larger philosophy that would profoundly influence Western thought. Socrates believed that the soul was far more important than the body, that virtue was more valuable than wealth, and that it was better to suffer injustice than to commit it. These weren't just abstract principles for him, but lived convictions that guided every decision he made. His commitment to these ideals would be tested repeatedly as Athens descended into the chaos and brutality of the Peloponnesian War. The conflict between Athens and Sparta wasn't just a struggle between two city-states, but a clash between two different ways of organizing society. Athens represented democracy, commerce, naval power, and intellectual freedom. Sparta embodied oligarchy, military discipline, land-based power, and conservative tradition. As the war dragged on year after year, it began to corrupt both sides. Athens, once proud of its democratic ideals and respect for justice, became increasingly imperial and brutal in its treatment of allies and enemies alike. The famous Melian dialogue, recorded by the historian Thucydides, captures this moral deterioration perfectly. When the tiny island of Melos tried to remain neutral in the conflict, Athens demanded submission, with the chilling logic that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Socrates served as a hoplite in several major battles during this devastating conflict. At Potidaea in 432 BC, he reportedly saved the life of young Alcibiades, carrying the wounded man to safety and ensuring that Alcibiades received the honours for bravery that were rightfully his. At Delium in 424 BC, when the Athenian army was routed and soldiers fled in panic, Socrates maintained his discipline and helped cover the retreat, walking calmly while others ran. These military experiences revealed another side of Socrates' character. He wasn't simply an abstract thinker who lived in the realm of ideas. He was a citizen who fulfilled his duties to the state, a soldier who faced death with the same calm courage he displayed in philosophical discussions. His fellow soldiers noted his extraordinary endurance, his ability to go without food or sleep when necessary, and his complete indifference to physical discomfort. But it was during these war years that Socrates also began to attract the attention and suspicion of Athenian authorities. Some of his closest associates were becoming involved in increasingly controversial political activities. Alcibiades, his most famous disciple, was brilliant but utterly without scruples, switching sides between Athens and Sparta as it suited his ambitions. Critias, another member of Socrates' circle, would later become one of the notorious 30 tyrants who terrorized Athens after its defeat. These associations would eventually prove dangerous for Socrates, but during the war years, his reputation remained largely intact. He was known as an eccentric but harmless philosopher, a man who asked uncomfortable questions but posed no direct threat to the state. That perception was about to change dramatically as Athens stumbled toward defeat and the city's democratic traditions came under increasing strain. The war was reshaping not just Athens' external circumstances, but its internal character as well. The plague that struck the city in 430 BC killed nearly a third of the population, including the great statesman Pericles. Traditional religious beliefs were weakening as people questioned why the gods had allowed such suffering. Democratic institutions were straining under the pressure of military necessity and popular fear. In this atmosphere of crisis and uncertainty, Socrates' questioning took on new significance. When he asked what justice meant, he wasn't just engaging in intellectual exercise, but touching on the fundamental question of how a society should organize itself. When he examined the nature of courage, he was exploring what it meant to be a citizen in a time of war. When he probed concepts of piety and virtue, he was challenging the moral foundations that held the community together. The philosopher, who had once seemed like a harmless eccentric, was becoming something far more dangerous in the eyes of Athens' traditional leaders. As the city struggled with military defeats, political upheaval, and social breakdown, Socrates' relentless questioning began to look less like innocent curiosity and more like deliberate subversion. The man who claimed to be Athens' greatest patriot was being seen by many as its most dangerous enemy. But to understand how this transformation occurred, we need to examine the extraordinary intellectual revolution that Socrates was quietly orchestrating in the Agora. While armies clashed and politicians schemed, he was developing ideas that would prove more powerful than any weapon and more enduring than any empire. These weren't abstract philosophical theories, but practical tools for living that challenged every assumption his fellow citizens held dear. Central to Socrates' revolutionary thinking was his concept of the soul. Most Athenians, like most people throughout history, focused primarily on external things: wealth, reputation, physical pleasure, political power. They measured success by visible achievements and judged people by their possessions, their family connections, or their ability to influence others. Socrates turned this entire value system upside down. He insisted that the soul was the only thing that truly mattered, and that the soul's condition determined whether a person's life was worth living. A beautiful body housing an ugly soul was far worse than an ugly body housing a beautiful soul. A wealthy person with a corrupted soul was more impoverished than a beggar who possessed wisdom and virtue. This wasn't just philosophical poetry for Socrates, but a lived reality that shaped every decision he made. This focus on the soul led him to one of his most controversial conclusions: virtue is knowledge. Most people assumed that knowing what's right and doing what's right were separate things. You might understand that honesty is good, while still choosing to lie when it serves your interests. You might recognize that courage is admirable, while still acting cowardly when faced with danger. Socrates rejected this common-sense view entirely. He argued that if someone truly understood what virtue was, if they grasped it, not just intellectually, but in the depths of their soul, they would be incapable of acting otherwise. No one does wrong willingly, he claimed. When people act badly, it's because they're confused about what's truly good for them. They mistake temporary pleasure for lasting happiness, immediate gain for genuine benefit, or popular approval for real worth. This doctrine had radical implications that extended far beyond individual behavior. If virtue could be taught through knowledge, then the entire basis of Athenian society needed rethinking. Why should political power be distributed by birth, wealth, or popular appeal when it should go to those who understood justice? Why should young people follow traditional customs when those customs might be based on ignorance? Why should anyone accept authority that couldn't justify itself through reason? Consider how threatening this must have seemed to Athens' established order. Imagine a young aristocrat returning home after a day with Socrates, suddenly questioning his father's business practices because he couldn't define what made them just. Picture a future politician who could no longer deliver confident speeches because Socrates had shown him he didn't understand the concepts he was using. Envision a priest who began doubting traditional religious ceremonies because he couldn't explain what made them pious. This wasn't theoretical disruption, but practical revolution, happening one conversation at a time. Socrates was creating what we might call a crisis of authority throughout Athens. He wasn't directly attacking the government, the military, or the religious establishment. He was doing something far more subversive. He was teaching people to think for themselves. The method he used to accomplish this transformation was as elegant as it was devastating. The Socratic dialogue typically began with what seemed like a simple, even naive question. Someone would make a confident statement about courage, justice, friendship, or any other important concept. Socrates would express admiration for their knowledge and ask them to explain what they meant, claiming he wanted to learn from their wisdom. His conversation partner, flattered by the attention and confident in their understanding, would offer a definition. Socrates would accept this graciously, then ask a follow-up question that seemed to flow naturally from what had just been said. Perhaps he would ask for an example, or wonder about a particular case, or explore how this definition related to other concepts they both accepted. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, contradictions would begin to emerge. The confident definition would prove too broad, excluding things that clearly should be included, or too narrow, including things that obviously didn't belong. The person would revise their definition, only to find that the new version created different problems. Each attempt at clarification would reveal new complexities, new contradictions, new areas of confusion. What made this process so powerful was that Socrates never directly attacked anyone's beliefs or claimed superior knowledge. He simply asked questions and listened carefully to the answers. He let his conversation partners discover their own ignorance through their own reasoning. When they finally reached that moment of aporia, that recognition that they didn't understand what they thought they knew, it came from within rather than being imposed from without. But Socrates didn't stop at exposing ignorance. He believed that this moment of confusion was actually the beginning of wisdom. Once you recognized that your comfortable certainties were illusions, you could begin the real work of seeking truth. The pain of discovering your ignorance was like the pain of childbirth, necessary for bringing something new and beautiful into existence. This is where Socrates' analogy to his mother's profession became most meaningful. Narrated had been a midwife, helping women bring forth babies they were already carrying. Socrates saw himself as practicing a similar art, but with ideas instead of infants. He helped people give birth to knowledge they already possessed but didn't know they had. The truth was already within them, waiting to be discovered through careful questioning and honest self-examination. The implications of this approach were staggering. If truth could be discovered through reason rather than received from authority, then every person had the potential to become wise. Knowledge wasn't the exclusive property of priests, politicians, or traditional teachers, but was accessible to anyone willing to examine their life honestly. A slave could potentially understand justice better than a king. A young person could surpass their elders in wisdom, and a poor man could be richer in the things that truly mattered than the wealthiest citizen. This democratic approach to knowledge was revolutionary in a society built on hierarchies of birth, wealth, and social position. It suggested that the current distribution of power might be completely arbitrary, based on accidents of fortune rather than genuine merit. It implied that traditional authorities might have no more claim to wisdom than anyone else, and that their commands should be evaluated by reason rather than accepted on faith. The young men who gathered around Socrates found this message intoxicating. Here was someone telling them that their worth wasn't determined by their family name, their inheritance, or their connections, but by their commitment to truth and virtue. He was offering them a path to genuine excellence that didn't depend on the lottery of birth or the whims of fortune. Among these eager disciples was Plato, a young aristocrat whose encounter with Socrates would shape the course of Western philosophy. Born into one of Athens' most distinguished families, Plato seemed destined for a conventional career in politics. He had the breeding, the education, the connections, and the wealth to rise to the highest positions in the state. But his meeting with Socrates changed everything. Plato was probably in his early 20s when he first encountered the philosopher, and the impact was immediate and profound. Here was someone who combined intellectual rigor with moral courage, who could make the most respected citizens look foolish through simple questions, and who lived according to principles rather than convenience. For a young man searching for meaning and purpose, Socrates represented everything that conventional Athenian society was not. Under Socrates' influence, Plato abandoned his political ambitions and devoted himself to philosophy. He became not just a student, but a kind of philosophical son, absorbing not only Socrates' methods, but his entire approach to life. The relationship between the two men would prove to be one of the most important mentorships in human history, though neither could have known it at the time. But Plato wasn't the only young aristocrat drawn to Socrates. Alcibiades, perhaps the most brilliant and certainly the most scandalous politician of his generation, also fell under the philosopher's spell. The relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades was complex and would ultimately contribute to both men's downfall, though in very different ways. Alcibiades possessed everything that Athenian society valued: extraordinary beauty, immense wealth, noble birth, military courage, and political talent. He was also utterly without moral restraint, willing to betray friends, lovers, and even his own city when it served his purposes. His association with Socrates became a source of endless fascination and speculation throughout Athens. What did the ugliest man in the city see in the most beautiful? What did the most principled philosopher find compelling about the most unprincipled politician? The answer seems to lie in Socrates' belief that even the most corrupted soul contained a spark of divine reason that could potentially be awakened. He saw in Alcibiades not what he was, but what he could become if he embraced philosophy seriously. For his part, Alcibiades was simultaneously attracted to and frustrated by Socrates. He recognized the philosopher's moral superiority and genuinely wished he could live up to Socrates' example. But he was too addicted to pleasure, too ambitious for conventional success, and too impatient with the slow work of self-examination to truly commit to the philosophical life. Their relationship became a kind of public drama that all Athens watched with fascination. Here was the city's most notorious pleasure seeker trying to seduce its most ascetic philosopher, while the philosopher tried to convert the politician to a life of virtue. Neither completely succeeded, but the tension between them illuminated fundamental questions about human nature, moral education, and the relationship between knowledge and character. The influence Socrates had on these young men wasn't limited to private conversations. He was reshaping an entire generation's understanding of what it meant to live well. Traditional Athenian education focused on practical skills, rhetoric for political success, military training for warfare, athletic competition for honor, and cultural knowledge for social acceptance. Socrates offered something entirely different, an education of the soul. He taught that the most important knowledge wasn't how to persuade others, defeat enemies, or accumulate wealth, but how to understand yourself. The famous inscription at the Oracle of Delphi read, "Know thyself," and Socrates made this ancient wisdom the foundation of his entire philosophy. You cannot live well if you don't understand your own nature, your own desires, your own capabilities, and your own limitations. This self-knowledge wasn't achieved through introspection or meditation, but through dialogue and questioning. You discovered who you were by testing your beliefs against reason, by examining your assumptions in conversation with others, and by constantly challenging yourself to think more clearly and live more consistently. The philosophical life was an active social endeavor that required both intellectual courage and moral commitment. But this emphasis on self-knowledge and personal virtue created tension with traditional Athenian values. The city had always celebrated public achievement, military glory, and political success. Heroes were those who conquered enemies, built monuments, or expanded the empire. Socrates was suggesting that the real heroes were those who conquered themselves, who built character rather than buildings, and who expanded understanding rather than territory. This wasn't just a difference in priorities, but a fundamental challenge to the entire social order. If the most important work was internal and invisible, then external achievements might be worthless or even harmful. If virtue was more valuable than victory, then Athens' military conquests might count for nothing. If wisdom was superior to wealth, then the city's commercial success might be meaningless. These implications became increasingly uncomfortable as Athens struggled through the final phases of the Peloponnesian War. The city that had once seemed invincible was now facing the prospect of total defeat. The democracy that had been the source of such pride was proving unable to make consistent, rational decisions about the crisis. The gods who were supposed to protect Athens seemed to have abandoned the city to its enemies. In this atmosphere of crisis and doubt, Socrates' questioning took on a new urgency and a new danger. When he asked what justice meant, he was implicitly asking whether Athens' treatment of its allies and enemies was justified. When he examined the nature of courage, he was raising questions about whether the city's military adventures were truly brave or merely reckless. When he probed the meaning of piety, he was challenging the very religious practices that were supposed to secure divine favour. The authorities began to pay closer attention to this strange philosopher and his circle of devoted followers. What they saw alarmed them. Here was a man who had never held political office, but wielded enormous influence over the city's future leaders. He claimed to serve the gods, but questioned traditional religious practices. He professed loyalty to Athens, but seemed to undermine every institution that made the city strong. Most troubling of all, some of his former associates were now openly hostile to Athenian democracy. Critias had become one of the 30 tyrants, the brutal oligarchs who seized power after Athens' defeat. Alcibiades had defected to Sparta and was now helping Athens' enemies. Other young men from Socrates' circle had been involved in various anti-democratic conspiracies and scandals. Was this mere coincidence, or was there something in Socrates' teaching that naturally led to contempt for democratic institutions? His critics began to argue that his constant questioning of authority, his emphasis on the superiority of knowledge over popular opinion, and his suggestion that most people were ignorant about the things that mattered most, all pointed towards an anti-democratic philosophy. These suspicions were fueled by Socrates' own behaviour and statements. He had never participated actively in democratic politics, claiming that his divine voice prevented him from seeking public office. He frequently criticised the practice of selecting officials by lot, arguing that important positions should go to those with knowledge rather than those chosen by chance. He compared the state to a ship and asked whether you would want the captain chosen by lottery or by expertise. Such analogies seem to suggest that democracy itself was fundamentally flawed, that the people were not qualified to govern themselves, and that power should rest with a philosophical elite who understood the true nature of justice and virtue. Whether Socrates actually held these views or was simply raising questions for discussion became increasingly irrelevant as political tensions in Athens reached a breaking point. The end of the war brought not relief, but fresh trauma to the battered city. Athens' defeat by Sparta was total and humiliating. The great walls that had protected the city were torn down. The mighty fleet was reduced to a handful of ships, and the empire that had stretched across the Aegean was dissolved. Worst of all, the democracy that had been Athens' proudest achievement was temporarily overthrown by the 30 tyrants, a group of oligarchs backed by Spartan military force. The reign of the 30 was brief but brutal. In just 8 months, they executed over 1,500 Athenians, confiscated property on a massive scale, and turned the city into a police state ruled by fear and suspicion. When democratic government was finally restored in 403 BC, the traumatized citizens were determined to prevent any future threats to their hard-won freedom. It was in this atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and determination to protect democracy that Socrates found himself facing the most serious challenge of his life. The authorities who had once viewed him as a harmless eccentric, now saw him as a potential threat to the stability of the restored democracy. The associations with former students who had betrayed the city, the questions he'd raised about democratic institutions, and the influence he continued to wield over Athens' youth all combined to make him a target. But the immediate trigger for the charges against Socrates came from a more personal source. In 399 BC, 3 Athenian citizens stepped forward to accuse the philosopher of crimes against the state. Meletus was a young poet, probably motivated by professional jealousy and a genuine belief that Socrates was corrupting the city's youth. Anytus was a wealthy politician and leather merchant who had personal reasons to resent Socrates' influence. Lycon represented the orators and teachers whom Socrates had often embarrassed with his questions. The formal charges they brought were carefully crafted to seem reasonable, while being almost impossible to refute definitively. Socrates was accused of impiety toward the gods of Athens and of corrupting the young men who followed him. These charges were vague enough to encompass almost anything Socrates had done or said, while serious enough to carry the death penalty if he were convicted. The trial that followed would become the most famous legal proceeding in Western history, not because of its legal significance, but because of what it revealed about the eternal tension between individual conscience and social conformity, between the pursuit of truth and the maintenance of order, between philosophy and politics. In that crowded Athenian courtroom, far more was at stake than the life of one elderly philosopher. As the morning of the trial arrived, Athens buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread throughout the city that Socrates, the famous gadfly who had spent decades questioning everyone and everything, would finally face judgment himself. Citizens streamed toward the courthouse from every district, eager to witness what promised to be the most dramatic legal spectacle in recent memory. The venue itself was imposing. 500 jurors, selected by lot according to democratic custom, filled the semicircular space with a sea of faces representing every class and profession in Athens. These weren't professional judges, but ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, and aristocrats, all mingling together in their role as arbiters of justice. The noise was overwhelming as hundreds of conversations echoed off the stone walls, creating a din that would have intimidated most defendants. But Socrates seemed remarkably calm as he entered this hostile environment. At 70 years old, he moved with the steady gait of someone who had marched in military formations and walked countless miles through the agora. His appearance remained as unconventional as ever. While most defendants dressed in their finest clothes and brought family members to evoke sympathy, Socrates wore his usual simple cloak and carried himself with quiet dignity. The prosecution spoke first, as was customary in Athenian courts. Meletus, the young poet who served as the primary accuser, delivered what he clearly hoped would be a devastating indictment. He painted Socrates as a dangerous subversive who had spent decades undermining the religious foundations of Athenian society and poisoning the minds of impressionable youth with his corrupting influence. The speech was carefully crafted to tap into the fears and resentments that had been building for years. Meletus reminded the jury of the recent trauma of the 30 tyrants and suggested that Socrates had played a role in creating the intellectual climate that made such tyranny possible. He pointed to the philosopher's former associates who had betrayed the city and argued that this pattern of treachery couldn't be mere coincidence. When it came time for Socrates to defend himself, the courtroom fell silent with anticipation. Everyone expected either abject apology or defiant rhetorics. What they got instead was something entirely unprecedented in Athenian legal history. Socrates began to question his accusers with the same method he had always used, turning his trial into an impromptu philosophical dialogue. The effect was electric. Here was a man facing death who refused to abandon his commitment to rational inquiry even in the most desperate circumstances. He systematically dismantled the charges against him, not through emotional appeals or technical legal arguments, but by exposing the logical contradictions in the prosecution's case. When Meletus claimed that Socrates corrupted the youth, the philosopher asked a simple question: who improves them? Meletus confidently replied that all other Athenians improve the youth, while only Socrates corrupts them. Socrates then drew an analogy to horse training. Would anyone seriously claim that all people improve horses, while only one person harms them? Obviously not. Horse training requires special knowledge and skill. If this is true for animals, wouldn't it be even more true for human beings? The logic was devastating, but Socrates wasn't finished. He pressed further. If he really corrupted young people, wouldn't he be harming his own community, and therefore himself? Would anyone deliberately damage their own environment? Either he wasn't corrupting anyone, or he was doing so involuntarily through ignorance. If the latter, then he needed education, not punishment. The religious charges received similar treatment. Meletus accused Socrates of being an atheist who didn't believe in the gods, but also of introducing new divine beings. Socrates pointed out the obvious contradiction. How could someone simultaneously believe in no gods and in new gods? The charges were incoherent, but perhaps the most powerful moment in the defense came when Socrates addressed the fundamental question of his life's mission. He told the jury about his friend Chaerephon's visit to the oracle at Delphi and the divine pronouncement that no one was wiser than Socrates. He explained how this had led him to question politicians, poets, and craftsmen, discovering that they all shared the same fundamental ignorance while believing themselves wise. This wasn't just biography, but philosophy in action. Socrates was demonstrating to the jury the very process of inquiry that had gotten him into trouble. He was showing them what it meant to examine life rather than simply live it. Even facing death, he couldn't resist the opportunity to educate, to provoke thought, to challenge assumptions. The most remarkable aspect of his defense was its complete lack of conventional legal strategy. Athenian defendants typically employed every available emotional appeal. They brought their children to court to weep before the jury. They detailed their military service and public benefactions. They begged for mercy and promised to reform their behaviour if spared. Socrates did none of this. Instead, he suggested that far from deserving punishment, he deserved to be maintained at public expense in the Prytaneum, the highest honour Athens could bestow. After all, he argued, he had spent his entire adult life serving the city as a kind of public servant, awakening his fellow citizens from their dogmatic slumber and urging them toward virtue and wisdom. The audacity of this suggestion must have stunned the jury. Here was a man on trial for his life, claiming that he deserved the same honour given to Olympic victors and great benefactors of the state. It was either breathtaking arrogance or breathtaking integrity, depending on your perspective. Throughout his speech, Socrates maintained that he was Athens' greatest patriot, precisely because he challenged its complacency. He compared himself to a gadfly sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse of the state into wakefulness. Without his constant questioning and probing, the city would sink into the kind of unreflective existence that led to moral and intellectual decay. This defense revealed the fundamental tension at the heart of the trial. Socrates genuinely believed he was serving Athens by forcing its citizens to think more clearly about justice, virtue, and the good life. His accusers genuinely believed he was undermining the social bonds that held the community together. Both sides were probably right from their own perspectives. The jury's decision came after hours of deliberation. When the votes were counted, the result was closer than many expected, but still decisive. 280 jurors voted for conviction, while 220 voted for acquittal. It was a narrow margin, suggesting that Socrates' defense had been more effective than his critics anticipated, but it was still a clear verdict of guilt. Under Athenian law, the next phase of the trial involved proposing penalties. The prosecution had asked for death, but the defendant could propose an alternative punishment, and the jury would choose between the two options. This was Socrates' opportunity to save his life through a reasonable counter-proposal. Instead, he doubled down on his earlier suggestion that he deserved public maintenance rather than punishment. When pressed to be more realistic, he offered to pay a fine of 1 mina, a laughably small amount that seemed to mock the entire proceedings. Only after intervention from his friends did he agree to propose a fine of 30 minae, though he made it clear he thought even this was excessive. The jury was not amused by what appeared to be continued contempt for their authority and the seriousness of the charges. When they voted on the penalty, the margin for death increased significantly. 360 jurors now voted for execution, meaning that 80 men who had initially voted for acquittal now decided that Socrates' attitude during the penalty phase proved he deserved to die. The sentence was death by hemlock, a relatively humane method of execution that involved drinking a poison made from the hemlock plant. The condemned would gradually lose sensation in their extremities as the poison worked its way upward through their body, eventually reaching the heart and lungs. It was considered a dignified way to die, befitting a citizen rather than a slave or foreigner. But the execution couldn't take place immediately. A religious festival honouring Apollo was underway, and Athenian law prohibited executions during sacred periods. The ship that had been sent to Delos to commemorate the god would need to return before Socrates could be put to death. This delay would last 30 days, giving the condemned philosopher a final month to reflect on his life and prepare for whatever lay beyond death. During this period, Socrates remained in prison, but was allowed to receive visitors. His friends came daily, some bearing desperate plans for escape that he consistently refused to consider. His family visited as well, though these meetings were apparently so emotional that he asked for his wife and young son to be taken home early on his final day. The conversations during these final weeks, later recorded by Plato, revealed a man completely at peace with his fate. Socrates spent his time doing what he had always done, engaging in philosophical dialogue, questioning assumptions, and exploring the deepest mysteries of existence. If anything, the approach of death seemed to intensify his commitment to the examined life. He used his remaining time to explore questions that had always fascinated him. What happens after death? Is the soul immortal? How should one face the unknown? These weren't abstract intellectual puzzles for Socrates, but the most practical questions imaginable, since he would soon know the answers firsthand. His friends found his calm acceptance almost supernatural. Here was a man who had been condemned to death by his own city, who was leaving behind a wife and young children, who was being forced to abandon the philosophical mission that had given his life meaning. Yet he seemed more interested in understanding the nature of death than in lamenting his fate. This extraordinary equanimity in the face of death became one of the most powerful aspects of the Socratic legacy. He demonstrated that philosophy wasn't just an intellectual exercise, but a way of life that could sustain someone through the ultimate test. His courage wasn't the physical bravery he had shown as a soldier, but moral courage of the highest order. The prison conversations also revealed the depth of affection between Socrates and his followers. These weren't merely students attending lectures, but friends who had been transformed by their relationship with the philosopher. They had watched him live according to his principles for decades, and now they were witnessing the ultimate test of those principles. Some tried to argue that he had a moral obligation to escape if possible, that his death would harm his friends and family more than his life would benefit them. Others suggested that accepting an unjust sentence was itself unjust, that he owed it to truth and philosophy to preserve himself for continued service. Socrates listened to all these arguments with his characteristic patience and attention, but he remained unmoved. He had spent his entire adult life arguing that it was better to suffer injustice than to commit it, and he wasn't about to abandon that principle now. Escaping from prison would violate his agreement with the laws of Athens, even if those laws had been unjustly applied in his case. More fundamentally, he believed that death might actually be a blessing rather than a curse. If death was simply a dreamless sleep, then it would be peaceful rest after a long life of labour. If death was a journey to another realm where he could continue questioning the great figures of the past, then it would be the ultimate philosophical adventure. This perspective on death reflected Socrates' deepest convictions about the nature of reality and human existence. The body was temporary and vulnerable, subject to pain, illness, and eventual decay. The soul, if it existed at all, belonged to a different order of reality altogether. Death was simply the separation of these two components, potentially liberating the soul from the limitations and distractions of physical existence. As the day of execution approached, Athens began to buzz with conflicting emotions. Some citizens felt vindicated that the troublemaker who had questioned everything would finally be silenced. Others began to have second thoughts about executing a man whose only crime seemed to be asking uncomfortable questions. Still others worried that the city was making a terrible mistake that would haunt its reputation for generations to come. The ship from Delos finally returned on a bright spring morning in 399 BC. The execution could now proceed according to law. As word spread through the city, people began gathering near the prison, some hoping for last-minute drama, others simply wanting to witness the end of an era. Inside the prison, Socrates spent his final hours, much as he had spent the previous decades, in philosophical conversation with friends. The discussion that morning focused on the immortality of the soul, with Socrates presenting several arguments for why death might not be the end of existence, but rather a transition to something better. When the jailer arrived with the cup of hemlock, Socrates received it with perfect composure. He asked if he could pour a libation to the gods, but was told there was only enough poison for the required dose. Instead, he offered a prayer that his journey from this world to the next would be prosperous, then drank the poison in one steady motion without hesitation or complaint. The final scene, as recorded by those present, was almost surreal in its calm dignity. As the poison began to work, Socrates walked around the cell until his legs grew heavy, then lay down and covered his face. He remained conscious and conversational until near the end, discussing the gradual loss of sensation with the same curiosity he had brought to every other phenomenon he had encountered. His last words were characteristically enigmatic. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not neglect it." Asclepius was the god of healing, and the sacrifice of a rooster was traditionally offered after recovery from illness. Was Socrates suggesting that death was a kind of healing, a cure for the sickness of life? The meaning remains debated to this day. Then the man who had spent 70 years examining life fell silent forever. Crito closed his friend's eyes, and the most influential philosopher in Western history passed into whatever realm awaits beyond the boundary of human knowledge. The immediate aftermath of Socrates' death was complex and contradictory. Some Athenians felt relief that a source of constant questioning and disruption had been eliminated. The city could now return to more traditional ways of thinking and behaving without the gadfly's constant stinging. Others began almost immediately to feel regret and shame about what had been done. Within a few years, the trial and execution of Socrates would be widely regarded as one of Athens' greatest mistakes. The city that prided itself on wisdom and justice had killed its wisest citizen for the crime of pursuing justice too earnestly. The democracy that celebrated free speech had silenced the one voice most committed to honest dialogue. But the most important consequence of Socrates' death wasn't what happened to Athens, but what happened to philosophy itself. His student Plato, traumatized by witnessing the execution of his beloved teacher, devoted the rest of his life to preserving and developing Socratic thought. The dialogues he wrote kept Socrates' voice alive for future generations and established philosophy as a distinct discipline worthy of lifelong study. Through Plato's writings, Socrates became immortal in a way he could never have achieved through mere biological survival. His method of questioning, his commitment to rational inquiry, his courage in the face of authority, and his insistence that the unexamined life is not worth living became permanent parts of Western intellectual tradition. The man who claimed to know nothing taught humanity how to think. The philosopher who owned almost nothing left a treasure more valuable than all the gold in Athens. The citizen who was condemned as a corrupter of youth became the teacher of every subsequent generation that values truth over comfort, wisdom over wealth, and integrity over survival. Today, 24 centuries after his death, Socrates remains more alive than most people who still breathe. Walk into any university philosophy department, any courtroom where lawyers probe witnesses with careful questions, any classroom where teachers refuse to simply give answers but instead guide students to discover truth for themselves, and you'll find Socrates still at work. His influence didn't end with Plato's devoted preservation of his memory. The ripple effects of that one life, that one method, that one commitment to questioning everything, spread outward in ways that transformed civilization itself. But to understand how a barefoot philosopher from ancient Athens became the invisible architect of modern thought, we need to trace the extraordinary journey his ideas took through history. The Socratic method didn't remain locked in ancient texts. It became the foundation of legal reasoning, scientific inquiry, and educational practice throughout the Western world. Every time a lawyer cross-examines a witness, they're using Socratic questioning to expose inconsistencies and reveal truth. Every time a scientist designs an experiment to test a hypothesis, they're following the Socratic principle of subjecting beliefs to rigorous examination. Every time a teacher asks students to think rather than simply memorize, they're practicing the art Socrates perfected in the Agora. But the reach of Socratic influence extends far beyond these obvious applications. The very concept of individual conscience, the idea that each person has both the right and the responsibility to think for themselves, traces directly back to that prison cell where Socrates chose death rather than compromise his principles. When later philosophers, religious reformers, and political revolutionaries stood up to authority in the name of higher truth, they were walking in footsteps first traced by the man who drank the hemlock. Consider what Socrates actually accomplished in his 70 years of life. He wrote nothing, built nothing, conquered nothing, accumulated nothing. By conventional measures of success, he was a complete failure. He lived in poverty, married badly, neglected his family responsibilities, and died as a convicted criminal. Yet his impact on human thought proved more lasting than the achievements of kings, generals, and empire builders whose names are now forgotten. This paradox would have delighted Socrates himself. Here was the ultimate proof of his central teaching, that appearances deceive, that conventional values are often upside down, and that true worth has nothing to do with external circumstances. The man who seemed to accomplish nothing accomplished everything that mattered. His influence on subsequent philosophy was immediate and profound. Plato took his teacher's method and created a complete philosophical system around it. The academy that Plato founded in Socrates' honor became the first university, establishing the model for higher education that persists today. Students came from across the Mediterranean world to learn the art of questioning that Socrates had perfected. But Plato wasn't the only student to carry forward the Socratic legacy. Xenophon preserved different aspects of his teacher's personality and method in his own writings. Other followers established competing schools that emphasized various elements of Socratic thought. The Cynics focused on his indifference to material possessions and social conventions. The Stoics adopted his emphasis on virtue as the only true good. The Skeptics developed his confession of ignorance into a complete philosophical position. Each of these schools claimed to be the true heir to Socratic wisdom, and in a sense, each was right. Socrates had been so rich and complex a figure that different followers could legitimately emphasize different aspects of his teaching. The method was flexible enough to support multiple interpretations while remaining recognizably Socratic in its commitment to rational inquiry and moral seriousness. As Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean world, following Alexander the Great's conquests, Socratic ideas traveled with it. Roman intellectuals like Cicero encountered Greek philosophy and adapted it to their own practical concerns. The Socratic emphasis on virtue and rational inquiry appealed to Roman sensibilities, even if the Romans were less interested in pure theoretical speculation than their Greek predecessors. When Christianity began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, it encountered a world already shaped by Socratic thought. Early Christian apologists like Justin Martyr argued that Socrates had been a kind of proto-Christian, that his commitment to truth and virtue had prepared the way for the gospel. They saw his willingness to die rather than compromise his principles as prefiguring Christ's sacrifice on the cross. This wasn't mere apologetic convenience. There were genuine similarities between Socratic and Christian values that made the fusion of Greek philosophy and Christian theology almost inevitable. Both traditions emphasized the superiority of soul over body, virtue over material success, and truth over popular opinion. Both challenged followers to examine their lives honestly and live according to higher principles, regardless of worldly consequences. The medieval period saw Socratic method transformed and preserved within Christian educational institutions. The scholastic method developed in medieval universities was essentially Socratic questioning applied to theological problems. Students learned to argue both sides of complex issues, to identify contradictions in apparently authoritative texts, and to think through problems systematically, rather than simply accepting traditional answers. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest of the scholastic philosophers, explicitly acknowledged his debt to Socratic method, even as he adapted it to serve Christian purposes. The careful distinction-making, the systematic examination of objections, and the patient working through of logical difficulties that characterized scholastic thought all reflected Socratic influence filtered through centuries of development. When the Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning, scholars rediscovered the original Socratic texts with fresh eyes. They found in Socrates a model of intellectual independence and moral courage that seemed to speak directly to their own concerns about authority, tradition, and individual judgment. Renaissance humanists saw themselves as reviving the Socratic mission of awakening humanity from dogmatic slumber. The Protestant Reformation, in its own way, represented a massive application of Socratic principles to religious authority. When Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church's claim to exclusive interpretation of Scripture, when he insisted that individual believers could and should read the Bible for themselves, when he declared that conscience bound by God's word could not be coerced by human authority, he was acting in profoundly Socratic ways. The scientific revolution that transformed European thought in the 16th and 17th centuries was deeply indebted to Socratic method. Scientists like Galileo, Kepler, and Newton didn't simply accept traditional explanations of natural phenomena, but subjected them to systematic questioning and empirical testing. The scientific method itself was essentially Socratic questioning applied to the natural world. Francis Bacon, often called the father of experimental science, explicitly acknowledged the connection between scientific inquiry and Socratic method. He argued that natural philosophy needed to abandon its reliance on ancient authorities and instead question nature directly through careful observation and experimentation. This was precisely what Socrates had done with human knowledge and behaviour centuries earlier. The Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century saw themselves as completing the work Socrates had begun. Voltaire, Diderot, and their colleagues applied systematic questioning to every aspect of human knowledge and social organisation. They challenged religious dogma, political authority, and social conventions with the same relentless logic that Socrates had applied to concepts like justice and virtue. Immanuel Kant, perhaps the most important philosopher since Plato, explicitly connected his critical philosophy to the Socratic tradition. His famous essay, What is Enlightenment?, could have been written by Socrates himself. Kant's call for humanity to have the courage to use its own understanding, to think for itself rather than rely on external authorities, was pure Socratic wisdom adapted to 18th century concerns. The democratic revolutions that swept through Europe and America in the late 18th century were profoundly influenced by Socratic ideas about individual moral responsibility and the importance of rational inquiry. When the American founders declared that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, they were applying Socratic principles about the inherent dignity and rational capacity of every human being. The concept of democratic government itself owes much to Socratic thought, despite Socrates' own apparent skepticism about Athenian democracy. The idea that political authority must justify itself through reason rather than mere force, that citizens have both the right and responsibility to question their leaders, and that good government depends on the moral and intellectual development of the people, all reflect Socratic influence. Modern educational theory is thoroughly saturated with Socratic principles. The progressive education movement of the early 20th century explicitly rejected rote memorization and passive absorption of information in favor of active inquiry and critical thinking. Educators like John Dewey argued that students learn best when they are encouraged to question, explore, and discover truth for themselves, rather than simply accept what they're told. Contemporary teaching methods in fields ranging from medicine to law to business rely heavily on Socratic questioning. Medical students learn diagnosis by being asked to work through symptoms and possibilities rather than simply memorizing lists of diseases. Law students develop legal reasoning skills by being challenged to defend and critique different interpretations of cases and statutes. Business students learn problem solving by being presented with complex scenarios that require careful analysis rather than simple application of formulas. The therapeutic techniques developed by modern psychology also show clear Socratic influence. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective forms of psychological treatment, essentially uses Socratic questioning to help patients identify and challenge the distorted thinking patterns that contribute to their problems. Therapists don't simply tell patients what's wrong with their thinking, but guide them through a process of self-discovery remarkably similar to what Socrates practiced in the Agora. Even in our digital age, Socratic principles remain relevant and powerful. The internet has made vast amounts of information available to anyone with access to a computer, but it has also made the ability to think critically about that information more important than ever. In a world of fake news, conspiracy theories, and information overload, the Socratic skills of careful questioning, logical analysis, and intellectual humility are essential for navigating complexity and uncertainty. The emergence of artificial intelligence and machine learning has raised new questions about the nature of knowledge, consciousness, and human uniqueness that would have fascinated Socrates. As machines become better at processing information and even at simulating human conversation, the distinctively human capacity for moral reasoning, creative questioning, and authentic self-examination becomes more precious than ever. Contemporary debates about ethics in technology, environmental responsibility, social justice, and global cooperation all require exactly the kind of careful thinking that Socrates pioneered. When we ask what obligations we have to future generations, what rights artificial intelligences might possess, or how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, we're engaging in fundamentally Socratic inquiries. The enduring power of Socratic method lies not in any specific answers it provides, but in its approach to questioning itself. Socrates showed us that the most important questions don't have easy answers, that wisdom begins with acknowledging our ignorance, and that the examined life is the only one worth living. These insights remain as relevant today as they were 24 centuries ago. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Socrates' legacy is how it continues to inspire individuals to stand up for their principles despite enormous pressure to conform. From early Christian martyrs to medieval heretics, from Enlightenment freethinkers to modern civil rights activists, people have found in Socrates a model of moral courage that transcends particular historical circumstances. When Galileo refused to recant his scientific discoveries despite threats from the Inquisition, when Thomas More chose execution rather than compromise his religious convictions, when Henry David Thoreau went to jail rather than pay taxes supporting slavery, when Martin Luther King Jr. accepted imprisonment for challenging unjust laws, they were all following the example set by the man who drank the hemlock rather than abandon his mission of questioning and teaching. This tradition of principled resistance to unjust authority represents one of Socrates' most important contributions to human civilization. He showed that there are things more important than life itself, that individuals have the power to choose their response to circumstances beyond their control, and that moral integrity can triumph over physical force even in apparent defeat. The questions Socrates asked about justice, virtue, courage, and wisdom remain as pressing today as they were in ancient Athens. What makes a life worth living? How should we treat other people? What do we owe to our communities and to future generations? How can we distinguish between knowledge and mere opinion? These aren't just philosophical puzzles, but practical challenges that every thoughtful person must face. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Socrates intuited, that the human brain is remarkably plastic, that our thinking patterns can be changed through practice, and that the process of questioning and examining our beliefs literally rewires our neural networks. When we engage in Socratic dialogue, we're not just exchanging ideas, but actually transforming the physical structure of our brains in ways that make us more capable of clear thinking and moral reasoning. The global challenges facing humanity in the 21st century require exactly the kind of collaborative inquiry that Socrates modelled. Climate change, technological disruption, social inequality, and cultural conflict can only be addressed through the patient work of people from different backgrounds coming together to question assumptions, examine evidence, and search for solutions that serve the common good. In our polarized political climate, Socratic method offers a path toward more productive dialogue. Instead of simply asserting our positions and attacking those who disagree, we could follow Socrates' example by asking genuine questions, listening carefully to responses, and working together to understand complex issues more deeply. This doesn't mean abandoning our convictions, but holding them more thoughtfully and being open to revision when evidence warrants it. The economic systems that govern our world would benefit from Socratic examination as well. When we ask fundamental questions about the purpose of economic activity, the meaning of prosperity, and the relationship between individual success and collective well-being, We're engaging in the kind of inquiry that Socrates would have appreciated. The assumption that endless growth is both possible and desirable, that market mechanisms automatically produce just outcomes, and that material accumulation leads to human flourishing, all deserve the kind of careful scrutiny that Socratic method provides. Educational institutions at every level could be transformed by taking Socratic principles more seriously. Instead of treating students as passive recipients of information, we could engage them as active participants in the search for truth. Instead of measuring success primarily through standardized tests and credentials, we could focus on developing the capacities for critical thinking, moral reasoning, and lifelong learning that Socrates considered most important. The healthcare system offers another arena where Socratic principles could make a significant difference. When doctors engage patients in genuine dialogue about their symptoms, concerns, and treatment preferences, when they acknowledge the limits of medical knowledge and work collaboratively to find the best approaches to healing, they're practicing a kind of medical Socratic method that often proves more effective than purely technical approaches to treatment. Even in our personal relationships, Socratic principles can deepen intimacy and understanding. When we approach our family members, friends, and romantic partners with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, when we ask questions designed to understand rather than to win arguments, when we're willing to examine our own assumptions and admit when we're wrong, we create the conditions for the kind of authentic connection that makes life meaningful. The spiritual dimensions of human existence also benefit from Socratic examination. Whether we're religious believers, agnostics, or atheists, we all grapple with questions about meaning, purpose, mortality, and transcendence that can't be answered through scientific method alone. Socratic inquiry offers a way of exploring these deep questions with intellectual honesty and moral seriousness without requiring us to abandon either reason or faith. The man who died in an Athenian prison cell 24 centuries ago continues to live wherever human beings gather to ask serious questions about how life should be lived. His method has been adapted, modified, and applied to circumstances he could never have imagined, but its essential spirit remains unchanged. The commitment to rational inquiry, moral integrity, and intellectual humility that defined Socrates continues to inspire and challenge everyone who encounters his example. As we face an uncertain future, filled with both unprecedented opportunities and dangerous challenges, we need Socratic wisdom more than ever. The technologies that give us power to reshape our world and ourselves require the kind of careful ethical reflection that Socrates pioneered. The global interconnectedness that makes us aware of suffering and injustice everywhere demands the kind of moral seriousness that he embodied. The complexity of modern life calls for the intellectual humility that he practiced. The complete life of Socrates teaches us that philosophy isn't an abstract academic discipline, but a way of living that can transform both individuals and societies. His example shows us that asking the right questions is often more important than having the right answers, that moral courage matters more than physical bravery, and that the examined life really is the only one worth living. In the immediate aftermath of Socrates' execution, Athens found itself grappling with an uncomfortable truth. The city that prided itself on being the birthplace of democracy had just killed its most persistent advocate for rational discourse. The irony was not lost on thoughtful Athenians, and within months a profound shift in public opinion began to take shape. The three accusers who had brought charges against Socrates suddenly found themselves the targets of popular resentment. Meletus, the young poet who had served as the primary prosecutor, faced social ostracism so severe that he was eventually forced to flee the city. Anytus, the wealthy politician, saw his reputation crumble as people began to question whether his motives had been pure or merely vindictive. The the tide of public sentiment was turning, and those who had orchestrated the philosopher's death were discovering that martyrdom has a way of transforming even the most controversial figures into symbols of justice. But the most immediate and lasting consequence of Socrates' death was its impact on his devoted followers. These young men, who had spent years absorbing his teachings and witnessing his unwavering commitment to principle, were now left to grapple with a world that suddenly seemed much darker and more arbitrary. The execution had not merely removed their teacher, it had shattered their faith in the very institutions that governed their society. Plato, perhaps the most profoundly affected of all Socrates' students, made a decision that would alter the course of Western civilization. Rather than pursue the political career that his aristocratic background had prepared him for, he chose instead to dedicate his life to preserving and developing his master's philosophical legacy. The young man, who might have become another forgotten Athenian politician, instead became the vehicle through which Socratic thought would reach future generations. The process of preserving Socrates' teachings presented unique challenges. The philosopher had deliberately avoided writing anything down, believing that true wisdom could only be transmitted through direct dialogue and personal relationship. His method was fundamentally interactive, depending on the specific personalities and circumstances of each conversation. How could such an approach be captured in static written form? Plato's solution was revolutionary. Instead of writing traditional philosophical treatises that presented arguments in systematic fashion, he created dramatic dialogues that brought Socrates back to life on the page. These weren't mere transcripts of actual conversations, though some may have been based on real discussions Plato had witnessed. Rather, they were sophisticated literary creations that captured the essence of Socratic method while exploring philosophical questions with unprecedented depth and rigor. The early dialogues, written in the years immediately following Socrates' death, focused primarily on ethical questions and demonstrated the classic patterns of Socratic inquiry. Characters would propose definitions of courage, justice, or piety, only to have Socrates systematically expose the inadequacies of their initial answers. The conversations typically ended in aporia, that state of productive confusion that Socrates considered the beginning of genuine wisdom. But as Plato matured as a philosopher in his own right, the dialogues became longer and more complex. While Socrates remained the central figure in most of these works, he began to articulate positions that went far beyond anything the historical Socrates had explicitly taught. Plato was not merely preserving his teacher's legacy, but developing it in new directions, using the Socratic method as a foundation for constructing comprehensive theories about reality, knowledge, and human nature. The impact of these dialogues was immediate and profound. Throughout the Greek world, intellectuals began to engage with Socratic ideas in ways that would have been impossible during the philosopher's lifetime. The written word allowed his method to spread beyond the confines of Athens, reaching audiences who had never had the opportunity to witness his questioning firsthand. Other students of Socrates also contributed to preserving his memory, though their approaches differed significantly from Plato's literary method. Xenophon, a practical-minded soldier and historian, wrote accounts that emphasized Socrates' conventional virtues and downplayed the more radical aspects of his teaching. These works presented a Socrates who was essentially a moral reformer rather than a revolutionary questioner of fundamental assumptions. The Cynic philosophers, led by figures like Antisthenes and later Diogenes, claimed to be following Socrates' example by rejecting material possessions and social conventions entirely. They took his indifference to wealth and status to extreme conclusions, living as beggars and deliberately shocking respectable citizens with their unconventional behaviour. While their lifestyle was certainly inspired by Socratic principles, Their crude public performances bore little resemblance to the subtle intellectual method that had made their supposed master famous. Meanwhile, other philosophical schools were developing different aspects of Socratic thought. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium, embraced Socrates' emphasis on virtue as the only true good, while developing sophisticated theories about logic, physics, and ethics. They saw him as the ideal wise man, someone who had achieved perfect harmony between reason and emotion through disciplined self-examination. The skeptics took Socrates' confession of ignorance as their starting point and developed it into a comprehensive philosophical position. They argued that since we can never be certain about anything, the wisest course is to suspend judgment entirely and live according to probability rather than dogmatic conviction. While this represented a radical interpretation of Socratic humility, it captured something important about his intellectual honesty and willingness to admit the limits of human knowledge. Each of these schools claimed to be the true heir to Socratic wisdom, and their disagreements often became quite heated. But perhaps this proliferation of competing interpretations was itself the most Socratic development of all. The master, who had spent his life questioning easy answers and comfortable certainties, would probably have been delighted to see his followers continuing to debate and disagree about the most fundamental questions of human existence. As Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean world, following Alexander the Great's conquests, Socratic ideas travelled with it. The philosophical schools, established in cities like Alexandria, Pergamon and Rhodes, all showed his influence, even when they developed in directions he might not have anticipated. The method of systematic questioning became a standard tool of intellectual inquiry, applied to everything from mathematical problems to literary criticism. Roman intellectuals encountered Greek philosophy with characteristic pragmatism, adapting what seemed useful while discarding what appeared merely speculative. They were particularly drawn to Socratic ethics, finding in his emphasis on virtue and rational self-control values that resonated with traditional Roman ideals. Figures like Cicero studied Socratic texts intensively and incorporated his methods into Roman legal and political discourse. The influence of Socratic thought on Roman culture was subtle but pervasive. The Roman concept of dignitas, the idea that true nobility comes from character rather than birth, reflected Socratic values even when not explicitly acknowledged. The Roman emphasis on duty and service to the state, while different from a Socratic individualism, shared his conviction that ethical principles should guide practical decisions. When Christianity began to emerge within the Roman Empire, it encountered a world already shaped by centuries of Socratic influence. Early Christian thinkers found in Socrates a figure who prefigured many of their own concerns. His willingness to die rather than compromise his principles, his belief in the immortality of the soul, and his conviction that virtue was more important than worldly success, all resonated with Christian values. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, explicitly argued that Socrates had been guided by the divine logos that Christians identified with Christ. While this interpretation stretched the historical evidence considerably, it reflected a genuine recognition of the spiritual dimensions of Socratic thought. The philosopher, who had claimed to be guided by a divine voice, was being incorporated into the developing tradition of Christian philosophy. Augustine of Hippo, perhaps the most influential of the early Christian philosophers, drew heavily on Socratic methods in his own spiritual journey. His confessions employed a form of rigorous self-examination that was clearly indebted to Socratic practices, even as it served distinctly Christian purposes. The famous scene in the garden where Augustine heard the voice telling him to take up and read represented a fusion of Socratic inquiry with Christian revelation. The medieval period saw Socratic method transformed and preserved within Christian educational institutions. The scholastic method developed in universities like Paris and Bologna was essentially Socratic questioning applied to theological problems. Students learned to examine authoritative texts critically, to identify apparent contradictions, and to work through complex logical problems systematically. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest of the scholastic philosophers, explicitly acknowledged his debt to Socratic method, even as he adapted it to serve Christian purposes. His Summa Theologica employed a structure that was recognizably Socratic. Questions were posed, objections were considered, authorities were cited, and systematic responses were developed. The careful distinction-making and logical rigor that characterized his work reflected centuries of Socratic influence filtered through the Christian intellectual tradition. But Socratic influence wasn't limited to formal academic settings. Medieval literature, art, and popular culture all showed traces of his impact. The tradition of courtly debate, the emphasis on rational argument in legal proceedings, and the ideal of the philosopher knight who combined intellectual and moral virtues all reflected Socratic values adapted to medieval circumstances. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning, and with it a fresh appreciation for Socratic method. Humanist scholars like Pico della Mirandola and Erasmus saw in Socrates a model of intellectual independence and moral courage that spoke directly to their own concerns about authority, tradition, and individual judgments. They were particularly drawn to his example of someone who had stood up to political and religious authorities in the name of higher truth. The Protestant Reformation represented in many ways a massive application of Socratic principles to religious authority. When Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church's claims to exclusive interpretation of Scripture, when he insisted that individual believers could and should read the Bible for themselves, when he declared that conscience bound by God's word could not be coerced by human authority, he was acting in profoundly Socratic ways. The scientific revolution that transformed European thought in the 16th and 17th centuries was deeply indebted to Socratic method. Scientists like Galileo, Kepler, and Newton didn't simply accept traditional explanations of natural phenomena, but subjected them to systematic questioning and empirical testing. The experimental method itself was essentially Socratic questioning applied to the natural world. Francis Bacon, often called the father of modern science, explicitly connected his inductive method to Socratic inquiry. He argued that natural philosophy needed to abandon its reliance on ancient authorities and instead question nature directly through careful observation and controlled experiments. This represented a direct application of Socratic principles to the investigation of physical reality. The Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century saw themselves as completing the work that Socrates had begun. Voltaire's critiques of religious dogma, Diderot's systematic questioning of traditional authorities, and Kant's critical examination of the foundations of knowledge all reflected Socratic influence adapted to modern concerns. They shared his conviction that human reason was capable of distinguishing truth from error if applied with sufficient rigor and honesty. Immanuel Kant's critical philosophy was explicitly connected to the Socratic tradition. His famous question, "What can I know?" was a direct descendant of Socrates' confession of ignorance. His insistence that reason must examine its own foundations before attempting to understand the world reflected the same spirit of systematic self-examination that had driven Socrates to question the oracle's pronouncement about his wisdom. The democratic revolutions that swept through Europe and America in the late 18th century were profoundly influenced by Socratic ideas about individual moral responsibility and rational inquiry. The concept that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, that citizens have both the right and responsibility to question their leaders, and that political institutions must justify themselves through reason rather than mere tradition, all reflected Socratic influence. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Socratic influence was how it continued to inspire individuals to stand up for their principles despite enormous pressure to conform. From early Christian martyrs who chose death rather than renounce their faith, to medieval heretics who challenged religious orthodoxy, to Enlightenment freethinkers who risked persecution for their ideas, people found in Socrates a model of moral courage that transcended particular historical circumstances. The man who had died in an Athenian prison rather than compromise his commitment to truth had created a template for principled resistance that would inspire countless others facing similar choices. His example showed that there are things more important than life itself, that individuals have the power to choose their response to circumstances beyond their control, and that moral integrity can triumph over physical force, even in apparent defeat. Modern psychology and neuroscience have confirmed many of Socrates' intuitions about human nature and the process of learning. Research has shown that the kind of active questioning he practiced is far more effective for developing critical thinking skills than passive absorption of information. Studies of cognitive bias have validated his suspicion that people often mistake confidence for knowledge, and that systematic self-examination is necessary to overcome the distortions that affect human judgment. The therapeutic techniques developed by modern psychology also show clear Socratic influence. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective forms of psychological treatment, essentially uses Socratic questioning to help patients identify and challenge the distorted thinking patterns that contribute to their problems. Therapists don't simply tell patients what's wrong with their thinking, but guide them through a process of self-discovery that would have been familiar to anyone who had encountered the philosopher in the Athenian agora. Contemporary educational theory is thoroughly saturated with Socratic principles. The progressive education movement explicitly rejected rote memorization and passive absorption of information in favor of active inquiry and critical thinking. Modern teaching methods in fields ranging from medicine to law to business rely heavily on Socratic questioning to help students develop problem-solving skills and independent judgment. But the influence of Socratic method extends far beyond formal educational settings. In our digital age, where vast amounts of information are available at the touch of a button, the ability to think critically about that information has become more important than ever. The Socratic skills of careful questioning, logical analysis, and intellectual humility are essential for navigating the complexity and uncertainty of modern life. The emergence of artificial intelligence and machine learning has raised new questions about the nature of knowledge, consciousness, and human uniqueness that would have fascinated Socrates. As machines become better at processing information and even at simulating human conversation, the distinctively human capacity for moral reasoning, creative questioning, and authentic self-examination becomes more precious than ever. The global challenges facing humanity in the 21st century require exactly the kind of collaborative inquiry that Socrates modelled. Climate change, technological disruption, social inequality, and cultural conflict can only be addressed through patient dialogue among people from different backgrounds who are willing to question their assumptions, examine evidence carefully, and search for solutions that serve the common good. The questions that Socrates asked about justice, virtue, courage, and wisdom remain as pressing today as they were in ancient Athens. What makes a life worth living? How should we treat other people? What do we owe to our communities and to future generations? How can we distinguish between knowledge and mere opinion? These aren't just philosophical puzzles, but practical challenges that every thoughtful person must face. The complete life of Socrates teaches us that philosophy isn't an abstract academic discipline, but a way of living that can transform both individuals and societies. His example shows us that asking the right questions is often more important than having the right answers, that moral courage matters more than physical bravery, and that the examined life is indeed the only one worth living. 24 centuries after his death, the barefoot philosopher from Athens continues to walk among us wherever human beings gather to ask serious questions about how life should be lived. His method has been adapted, modified, and applied to circumstances he could never have imagined, but its essential spirit remains unchanged. The commitment to rational inquiry, moral integrity, and intellectual humility that defined Socrates continues to challenge and inspire everyone who encounters his extraordinary example. In our interconnected world, where information travels at the speed of light and opinions clash in digital forums that would have astounded ancient Athenians, the Socratic approach offers something increasingly rare: a method for genuine dialogue across difference. When we encounter viewpoints that challenge our deepest convictions, when we face complex problems that resist simple solutions, when we find ourselves caught between competing values that all seem legitimate, we can turn to the example of the man who spent his life navigating exactly these kinds of intellectual and moral challenges. The corporate boardrooms where executives make decisions affecting millions of lives, the research laboratories where scientists probe the mysteries of existence, the courtrooms where lawyers seek justice through adversarial questioning, the classrooms where teachers guide students toward understanding. All of these modern institutions carry forward the work that began in an ancient marketplace, with a peculiar philosopher who refused to accept easy answers. Consider how Socratic principles might transform our approach to the most pressing challenges of our time. When we debate the ethics of genetic engineering, we're asking fundamentally Socratic questions. What does it mean to be human? What constitutes improvement versus harm? How do we balance individual choice with collective responsibility? The method that exposed the contradictions in ancient Athenian thinking about courage and justice can help us navigate the moral complexities of technologies that give us unprecedented power over life itself. The climate crisis that threatens our planet's future demands exactly the kind of rigorous self-examination that Socrates practiced. We must question our assumptions about progress, prosperity, and what constitutes a good life. We must be willing to admit that many of our comfortable beliefs about endless growth and technological solutions may be illusions as dangerous as any that Socrates encountered among the confident politicians of his day. From that dusty Athenian courtroom to the digital forums of today, Socrates' voice continues to echo through every genuine conversation about what matters most. His life reminds us that wisdom isn't found in accumulating answers, but in perfecting the art of asking better questions. The man who claimed to know nothing gave us everything we need to think clearly, live courageously, and examine our existence with unflinching honesty. In a world drowning in information, but starving for wisdom, perhaps it's time we all became students of the barefoot philosopher who drank hemlock rather than stop asking why.